can never have too many tools. Shop DeWalt deals at Lowe's. Get a free Select DeWalt 20-Volt Max Power Tool when you buy a Select 20-Volt Max 5-amp-hour battery kit. Plus, get a free additional DeWalt 20-Volt Max 8-amp-hour battery when you buy a DeWalt 10-inch 20-Volt Max dual-bevel compounded miter saw. Our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 6/24 while supplies last. Selection varies by location.
Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Ralph DeFalco III, a retired U.S. Navy captain who served as Deputy Director of Intelligence at the National Joint Operations and Intelligence Center, about his new book, The Counterfeit, and the high-stakes covert spy wars between the U.S. and China. And then we break down the latest on the U.S.-Iran war, the possibility of American military intervention in Cuba, and the rise of cutting-edge drone boats. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined as always by my esteemed co-host Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. There used to be such a thing as what we thought of as the slow summer news period, and those days, of course, are long gone because it's over 90 degrees outside and there is no shortage of news to talk about this week. And coming up later, we've got Ralph DeFalco III, a longtime military intelligence professional, to talk about his debut novel set in a fictional future in which the U.S. essentially has lost a conflict with China, and also his view on U.S.-China intel wars and how they're playing out behind the scenes right now all over the world. So stay tuned for that really interesting interview coming up in just a couple minutes. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar this week?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here again. We could talk about the UFC fight on the White House lawn, and I'm sure that people will be listening to this in the aftermath of that, and we may talk about it next week. But right now I am tracking a range of things, most pointedly the extent to which President Trump's ceasefire with Iran is essentially dead. As we record this episode on June 11, the U.S. and Iran were literally trading fire. U.S. Central Command put out a statement saying its forces carried out new, quote, self-defense strikes, end quote, mainly trying to hit Iranian military facilities, radar centers, drone depots. This was the second time in as many days that U.S. forces in the Middle East have launched new strikes inside Iran. All the while, Iranian military officials are giving no indication that Tehran wants to return to the brief ceasefire that got announced a week ago. Iranian forces launched missiles again in recent days at Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan, accusing them of being U.S. security allies. And the foreign ministry in Tehran issued a statement on June 11 saying the ceasefire is, quote, meaningless, end quote. None of this bodes well for the Trump administration's push for real nuclear talks with Iran or some kind of exit strategy, Ben. We're going to continue to track the moment-to-moment in the daily Threat Status newsletter. One other quick note, because I know you want to say something here. Anybody listening right now should grapple with the reality that Tehran is outraged that the Israeli military has continued in recent days to bomb southern Lebanon. Israeli leaders say it's all part of a once-in-a-generation chance to finally crush Iran-backed Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon. My read is that the Iranians, as chaotic as their side of the table is at this point, have tried to signal to President Trump that they might be willing to negotiate with him or his emissaries if, and it's a big if, he can somehow stop the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah. Reality check, those attacks aren't stopping. And hawks in Washington, by the way, don't want them to stop. I encourage listeners to go check out a story that we published this past week under the headline, Iran War Pushes Trump-Netanyahu Friendship to limit.
It's just one of the several dynamics, sort of interpersonal and geopolitical dynamics at play here with this whole U.S.-Iran conflict. But we can't talk about that conflict without talking about this incident earlier this week, and you just referenced it with the ceasefire being dead. Well, part of the reason it seems to be dead is that Iran shot down a U.S. Apache helicopter, and the 2 Army crew members were eventually rescued near the Strait of Hormuz by, in part, the use of an unmanned autonomous surface vessel, or a drone boat. This particular boat was the Corsair, a 24-foot-long vessel made by the Texas-based company Saronic. Washington Times national security correspondent John Seward and I wrote about that this week. Now, you might remember that just last week on this show, Barry Hinckley, the president of Blue Ops, talked about how the U.S. is in a new maritime era because of drone boats, unmanned surface vessels. And here we are, a couple days after that interview went live. U.S. forces used a drone boat to carry out a really difficult, time-sensitive mission in which soldiers' lives were literally on the line. So we're not in a theoretical realm anymore with these autonomous boats. They are now, today, already a real part of U.S. maritime strategy, and they would certainly be a big, big part of any American military activity in the Pacific, especially a potential clash with China. So look, if you want to hear more about this, you're in luck, because Threat Status, as we've announced before on the show, is hosting an event on June 24th at the Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C., titled Indo-Pac 2026. And I will be hosting a panel discussion all about scaling uncrewed systems for the Indo-Pacific fight. So we're going to have key members of Congress, defense industry leaders, analysts on this panel to talk about exactly that. What can these drone boats do? How many do we need, especially for the Pacific? Do we have the industrial capacity to make them? What kinds of missions can they do? How do they integrate with land, air, space, traditional maritime assets, aerial drones, all of that? So we'll be talking more about this event next week on the show ahead of June 24th. But look, the timing couldn't be better, I think, especially as far as this drone boat revolution that we seem to be at the front end of right now goes.
Totally interesting, Ben. Thanks for plugging the June 24 event. People can attend by RSVPing on the Threat Status pages on the Washington Times website. It's going to be pretty interesting and special and, frankly, educational. I also will be there moderating a panel on shipbuilding with retired U.S. Admiral Mark Montgomery, Leonardo DRS CEO John Baylooney, and Hanwha Defense USA CEO Michael Coulter. I'll also be doing a fireside chat with President Trump's Office of Management and Budget Director, Russ Vought. A couple quick more news items right now, though, Ben. We noted in the newsletter this week that Ukraine's military is rolling out a new missile and artillery development concept to domestically produce a long-range strike capability that would put Moscow well within range of Ukraine's own homemade ballistic and cruise missiles. Finally, Ben, it's been on my radar that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un voiced support for China's sovereignty claims over Taiwan during a summit in recent days in Pyongyang with Chinese leader Xi Jinping.
Yeah, it's certainly something worth keeping an eye on. So, of course, follow the Threat Status Daily newsletter for updates on all of that. Before we get to Ralph DeFalco, I want to talk for just a minute about Cuba. I wrote this week about what the U.S. could expect to confront if, in fact, we decide to launch a military operation aimed at removing President Miguel Diaz-Canel or arresting Raul Castro, the brother of the late Fidel Castro, who is now the subject, Raul Castro is, of a Justice Department case for his alleged role in the 1996 shootdown of 2 U.S. civilian airliners. This idea of U.S. military action against Cuba, this isn't theoretical either, because Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was at the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay just this week. That base is home to about 3,000 U.S. military personnel and, of course, home to the post-9/11 era detention facility at Guantanamo. And Secretary Hegseth explicitly said the Pentagon is ready if President Trump decides to order some kind of military action, whether that's airstrikes, a special forces mission to capture the president or Raul Castro, similar to what we did in Venezuela with Nicolas Maduro, or even a ground invasion, though that seems pretty unlikely based on everything that I'm hearing. I'd encourage you all to go read that story for more detail on this, including some good analysis from friend of the show, Chris Sabatini of Chatham House, who told me there are any number of reasons to be cautious about a potential U.S. operation in Cuba. For one, that the top-down structure of the Communist Party leadership there makes it more difficult, at least on paper, for the U.S. to find and install a new leader that it approves of. Is there a figure like Delcy Rodriguez, the Venezuelan vice president, who immediately stepped in to become president when Maduro was captured, and she subsequently faced a ton of pressure from the Trump administration to basically do whatever the U.S. wanted? Now, there are growing signs that her political position in Caracas is getting a little tenuous. We can revisit that discussion another day. On Cuba, you might also face the possibility of real social unrest after a U.S. operation. The country already can't provide goods and services to a lot of its people. So are we willing to put troops on the ground, U.S. troops, to maintain order if necessary? Would Guantanamo Bay come under a guerrilla-style attack from Cuban security forces? I'd be willing to bet Secretary Hegseth asked that question when he was there this week in terms of what U.S. preparations would be for that possible contingency. Could Cuba use the drones they've reportedly gotten from Iran and Russia to target U.S. troops at Guantanamo or elsewhere? Are we ready for that? So the bottom line is this: from a strictly military planning perspective, this is pretty straightforward. Cuba can't defend itself against the U.S. military. We could run the whole operation out of U.S. military bases in Florida or the Gulf or Navy assets right off the coast because Cuba's 90 miles from Florida. So from that perspective, we can basically do whatever we want militarily, I think, within reason. But that doesn't mean that any mission would be a success, at least not in the long term. We'll see if it happens, Guy. But I mean, look, as we've seen recently with Venezuela and with Iran, when you start to see a lot of smoke here, troop movements, visits by defense secretaries and CIA directors, and a lot of kind of public comments, including some from the president in recent months about this, recent history, at least in a couple of cases, would suggest that military action might not be too far behind. And we are joined now by Ralph DeFalco III, a retired U.S. Navy captain who served as Deputy Director of Intelligence at the National Joint Operations and Intelligence Center. He's a former faculty member at National Intelligence University and a fleet professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Ralph has 5 decades of operational intelligence experience and has served all over the world. And he's got a new book, The Counterfeit, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. But Ralph, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Ben, Guy, it's a delight to be with you. I'm looking forward to this immensely.
Ralph, I want to start with The Counterfeit, and I'll confess I haven't read it in full yet, but I do intend to because it looks absolutely fascinating. And it's your debut novel and is set in kind of a near future United States in which the U.S. has more or less been defeated in a Pacific conflict with China. And your book examines an America manipulated by a foreign power with internal security divisions and sort of kind of a different way of life or a different form of government in the United States that we're all used to. There's a lot to unpack here. I would encourage listeners to pick up a copy and read this book. But I'm curious how close to reality you think some of this is, both in terms of the external aspect, a war with China, and the internal, the U.S. maybe becoming more deeply divided and maybe leaning toward more of a security state. But let's start with the former, the idea of the U.S. actually losing a conflict with China in the Pacific. You had access to all sorts of military intelligence during your very long, distinguished career. How possible or realistic do you think that is right now? Is it likely? And what would the conflict have to look like in order for China to have an advantage and beat the United States?
Well, that's an excellent question. We're in a situation right now where the United States is facing a peer competitor in China. It's a remarkable circumstance when you consider that just 30 years ago, no one would even have considered China militarily as a co-equal with the United States. No one would have considered China really economically as a peer competitor with the United States. So those two factors, economic power and military power, set the stage for what could be a catastrophic confrontation. And that catastrophe could be ignited by any one of a number of different scenarios. In my novel, The Counterfeit, I allude to Taiwan, an invasion of Taiwan. I allude to a rupture on the Korean Peninsula, a second Korean War. And both of those scenarios are packed, absolutely packed, with the potential to involve the United States in a more, not a global war, but a regional war in the Pacific. And those are the kinds of things that lay the groundwork, I think, for the first couple of chapters in the Counterfeit.
So conversely, I mean, potentially, I think I'm even more curious about this aspect of it, and that's the idea of kind of, and you explore this in great depth in the book. What happens to the United States after something like that? This idea of a really even more deeply politically fractured United States than we have now, one where there's, you know, an internal security division essentially ruling over a population that's really just kind of shaken by losing this war. It sounds a bit dystopian, I think. I'm sure you probably would agree with that to some degree, but do you think the ground is fertile here in the U.S. for that kind of a dynamic to emerge in the wake of maybe a military defeat like that?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you asked that question because a great deal of my novel, while it may sound dystopian, some people have suggested that it's predictive, not dystopian, but predictive. And I like to say that it's predictive in that it takes existing scenarios and historical relevance and puts that into the novel. The pages of The Counterfeit draw deeply on history. So you'll see a little bit of the Weimar Republic in here. You'll see a little bit of the post-Civil War era in the United States here. You'll see the rise of the growth of authoritarianism in Germany in the 1930s. So all of those historical trends are built into the pages of The Counterfeit, and I extrapolate those to develop an America that perhaps we're very uncomfortable with, but we could actually see emerging with an authoritarian state trying desperately to manage acute political divisions in the country.
One more quickly, Ralph, to follow up before Guy jumps in here. Based on your career as a longtime intelligence professional, what do you think is the next stage of how adversaries capitalize on, you know, you said your book is in some ways predictive. So there's a lot of those divisions are here. The seeds have already, of course, been sowed over a long period of time. What's the evolution, going beyond 2016 election meddling and Russian bot networks and other ways that adversaries have used social media and ways to influence our social discourse in this country? Where's that going? What does the next wave of that look like? Is it driven by AI? What do you think people who are kind of in your chair now in the intelligence world, where are they looking as the next wave of that?
I think you're absolutely on target when you talk about social media, when you talk about AI, when you talk about the internet, when you talk about the impact that these disparate forms of communication have and their reach. 40 years ago, there was no internet. There was no global reach from adversaries. They had to rely on other mechanisms. They had to rely on propaganda. They had to rely on human sources. They had to rely on getting inside of the country. Now that reach has been expanded exponentially with the use of the internet, and AI creates an entirely new environment where you can exploit these openings in society. And moreover, you can exploit those to create divisiveness. You can exploit those to sow the seeds for violence. You can exploit that as well to go ahead and begin a process of eliciting support inside the country for a foreign power. I don't have to tell you both about how effective the United Front Work Department has been. The news lately has told us repeatedly about Chinese agents operating in the United States. Those are all people who've been manipulated and coached and financed by the United Front Work Department, a division of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's only going to get worse in the years to come as China continues to try to exercise influence over American policy, both domestic and foreign.
Ralph, it's Guy Taylor. I definitely want to drill into this this idea of U.S.-Chinese intelligence wars that you're bringing up. But first, I have to ask you, with regard to your novel, The Counterfeit, to what extent was Philip K. Dick and his great dystopian novel from the last century, The Man in the High Castle, to what extent was that an influence? The plot of that book being that Germany and Japan had won World War II and split the U.S. in half, among other things.
And those kinds of explorations of alternate history are not unusual. We've seen a great many novels written in that regard. So, alternate history, I think, played a role in framing the pages of the counterfeit, not only in alternate history, but projections beyond the losing of the war, the loss of the country's identity. The counterfeit works on so many different levels, but one of the levels on which it works, of course, is that the United States has become a counterfeit of what it once was. It's not just the actors in this book that are counterfeits. Philip Nolan, of course, my protagonist, takes the place of his insidious brother as the head of the Internal Security Division of the Department of Homeland Security, which has really become the American Gestapo in this novel. And he is one counterfeit. The country is a counterfeit. Many of the actors in the novel, the characters in the novel, are not what they seem. And I think that was part of the genus for the title as well.
Okay, this is totally interesting. But all right, so second thing is with regard to great power geopolitics today, do you see it that there is a major Cold War style spy war playing out between the US and Chinese intelligence agencies? I'm going to assume that your answer is yes, totally. But tell us your take on this. What is the most important aspect of that spy war that people outside the IC might not realize?
And the most important aspect of what's going on with the U.S. intelligence and the Chinese Communist Party's intelligence apparatus is rooted really in avoiding conflict. It's the intelligence necessary so that both sides can back away from a precipice if, in fact, things go hot. The amount of intelligence information that we gather is insignificant compared to the quality of the intelligence that we gather. Just gathering volumes of information is not enough. It's got to be the right kinds of information. And for the US China relationship, it's really insights into leadership, it's insights into political ramifications of political decision making that's being done in China, and how China relates to the rest of not only Asia, but the rest of the world. So when we look at intelligence, and especially intelligence about China, we're looking at the need for high quality insights into leadership, their thinking, their plans, and their ambitions.
I want to ask one more specific thing here that's maybe sounds really pedestrian, but if you look back at history with regard to intelligence wars and great power intelligence wars, are you concerned about, particularly in the AI era, are you concerned about the issue of mistranslation or the mistranslation of messaging and how that plays into power politics, that Chinese intelligence may literally be mistranslating messaging from the Trump administration, or that players in or on the periphery of the U.S. intelligence community might be mistranslating messaging from the CCP in a way that can derail or misguide overall national security policy?
Guy, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There is, of course, the potential to misinterpret the signals that any potential adversary is sending. There is a great deal of confusion that can occur, especially when you're crossing cultural and language divides. So this is all part of the challenge in conducting intelligence operations in the 21st century, but it's really nothing new. We've seen this previously. We know that, for example, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union came within an eyelash of having a nuclear confrontation. And it was only avoided because one very, very courageous Russian officer believed that the signals they were getting were false, incorrect, and backed away from what could have been a catastrophic confrontation at the nuclear level.
Ralph, I want to follow up on something you just mentioned, because it's been very much top of mind for me, and that's the role of intelligence agencies and intelligence professionals in preventing a war that you were just referring to. I was just at the Special Operations Forces Week convention in Tampa last week, and that was a message from the head of U.S. Special Operations Command, is that special forces are at the center of trying to prevent what he called what would be a devastating great power war, referring to the U.S. and China. I'm curious if we flip that around. from your perch, all the experience you have and the research you've done for this book, does China look at that the same way? Are there voices in the CCP and in the highest levels of the Chinese government who actively are trying to avoid a war with the United States? What's your read on how they see it from their side of the lens?
I believe that if there are those kinds of voices in China, and if they're inside the Chinese Communist Party, that they are very circumspect in what they speak to power. Speaking truth to power in China is a double-edged sword. And you have to be incredibly careful in China when you are giving leadership insight, especially into an adversary, a potential adversary like the United States or Japan or India. All of those countries have special relationships with China and can tip at any moment. We've seen it happen already. We've seen it on the Sino-Indo border. So intelligence officers, intelligence operatives inside the Chinese Communist Party, I think, have to look at the political nature of their message when they are packaging the truth.
Ralph, last one in the couple minutes we have left here. I know you served in the Mideast as well, so I do have to ask about current events and specifically the conflict between the U.S. and Iran, which is, of course, moving so rapidly, and we don't want to get too bogged down in the day-to-day specifics. We could have a deal to end the war announced as we record this podcast, so we'll stay away from that. But just big picture, I'm curious from your point of view, how hard is it to get accurate intelligence, whether it's the U.S., the Israelis, or anyone, to get accurate intelligence out of Iran? Do you get the sense, do we have reliable intelligence on what leadership in Tehran is thinking and who's actually making decisions on a day-to-day basis? Because we get such conflicting accounts from this administration in the U.S. publicly versus public statements out of Iran. Sometimes what we hear out of Israel is different. Behind the scenes, do you think the intelligence picture out of Tehran is clearer or not?
The intelligence picture coming out of Iran, especially with respect to the intent of leadership, is very clouded. We're not quite certain who exactly is trying to call the shots at this point in Iran. We do know that leadership has been severely damaged. Their leadership mechanisms have been badly broken. And I believe that without clear insights into the current leadership, it's going to be very, very difficult to forge a way ahead. I'm confident, however, having said that, I believe that the Israelis may have developed some excellent sources inside of the Iranian leadership cadre.
Ralph DeFalco, check out his book, The Counterfeit. Thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks, Ralph.
Hey, Ben, Guy, thank you. Appreciate you both.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all listen to the show. Guy, what do you have for us as your Threat of the Week?
Ben, my threat of the week is that Chinese state-linked hackers are systematically targeting American AI tech companies at a scale much larger than most public reporting has indicated. That was a key finding of a new report this week from the Austin, Texas-based security firm CrowdStrike, and it's my threat of the week.
It's a good one. My threat of the week focuses on a pretty frequent topic on this show, and that's nuclear weapons, and specifically how nuclear-armed countries are upgrading and modernizing their arsenals at a time when things like the New START Treaty and other agreements meant to limit nuclear weapons are dying. Our colleague Mike Glenn wrote about this in the Washington Times this week and looked at a report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute that offered a lot of good detail on how nations are increasingly using nuclear weapons as instruments of national power in the 21st century. In other words, the post-Cold War period in which it seemed like perhaps the world was on a new trajectory toward fewer nuclear weapons and less concern about the prospect of nuclear strikes is over. And we've detailed in this show before how much money and effort China has invested in its own nuclear program and its attempts to build something of its own version of a nuclear triad, referring to the U.S. ability to fire nuclear weapons from land, sea, or the air. China is still far behind the U.S. and Russia, which control more than 80% of the world's stockpiled nuclear warheads. But that equation, as we've detailed before, is changing. And in total, there are more than 12,000 nuclear weapons controlled by 9 countries. That includes, by the way, 3 members of the Acts of Authoritarians, China and Russia, of course, and also North Korea. So the threat right now is that this just keeps snowballing. We've seen signs from President Trump recently that he does want to get a 3-way dialogue going between the U.S., China, and Russia on some sort of a new nuclear arms deal. I'm pretty skeptical about that happening, at least in the short term, given all the other fires that are raging around the world right now. So right now, again, nuclear weapons at the center of great power, jockeying and geopolitics, and that's potentially really dangerous, and that is why it's my threat of the week. And with that, thank you, Guy. A huge thanks to Ralph DeFalco III. Definitely go check out his book, The Counterfeit. And most of all, a big thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go sign up, register for this June 24th Indo-Pac 2026 Threat Status event in Washington, and subscribe to the Threat Status podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll be back next week here on the Threat Status podcast.